He is a medical graduate from Neil Ratan Sarkar Medical College. He is an expert in various medical specialties. After doing his graduation, he joined the prestigious All India Institute of Medical Sciences and successfully completed his MD in pathology, which has nothing to do with today's topic. After finishing MD pathology, probably his desire for clinical skills came calling, and he joined MD in pediatrics at the Jawaharlal Nehru Medical College at Aligarh Muslim University. After successfully completing that, he did his DM in neurology from King George's Medical University. It's a university now, from Lucknow, and that is what brings him on the dais today. His areas of special interest are stroke, headache, epilepsy, pediatric neurology, demyelinating disorders, and movement disorders. He has several publications in various national and international journals to his credit, and he is presently placed as a consultant in neurology at the PSRI hospital. He is also available at the Mind Vision Neurology Clinic at E12 Green Park. So today he will be talking about the latest in the management of acute ischemic strokes. Friends, please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Thank you, sir, for those kind words. It is indeed a privilege for me for having this opportunity to speak before such an esteemed audience, comprising of all the legendary, as sir told, legendary physicians and surgeons of South Delhi. So, and with special thanks to Dr. Sushil Chauhan, who encouraged me for this talk. So without much ado, let's begin for what we have assembled here. So I shall be talking about the management of acute ischemic stroke. So I'm not a very great fan of definitions. However, what is stroke? First of all, stroke is basically an abrupt cessation of a part, a particular area of brain, which leads to cerebral dysfunction, either global or focal, and which can lead to disabilities, minor, major disabilities, and also death also. So worldwide, stroke is one of the most important causes of morbidity and long-term disability. It is the second leading cause of death after ischemic heart disease. Annually, 15 million people worldwide suffer stroke, out of which 5 million die, and another 5 million are permanently disabled. It is also the second most common cause of dementia, most frequent cause of epilepsy in elderly, and a frequent cause of depression. So, stroke is a medical emergency, and the time window for the treatment is very narrow. The majority of the stroke patients are not able to reach hospital within time, and this is a particularly problem in our country, because we do not have an emergency medical system in place. So what are the 8 Ds of stroke care? First of all, the greatest challenge is to detect the symptoms of acute stroke in the field, outside the hospital setting. So the detection is the first problem, because people are not aware when to suspect, the common people are not aware when to suspect the acute stroke. So detection is the first step. Then we call the helpline number. So an ambulance is dispatched. Then the patient is taken and delivered to the hospital, and a prior notification to the hospital is made that a particular patient of stroke is arriving. As soon as the patient arrives at the door, we have to do an immediate ED triage. We have to collect the data in terms of prompt clinical evaluation, prompt lab studies and CT imaging at the minimum. We have to make a decision based on the data we have collected regarding the diagnosis and the decision about the next step. Now we administer the drug, which is the Altiplase, the tissue plasminogen activator. After we have administered the drug, the patient is disposed to the acute stroke unit, where the stroke patients are cared for. So, how to spot a stroke patient in the field? So, this mnemonic is very helpful. Be fast. B stands for balance loss. With any patient having acute loss of balance, E stands for eyesight changes. F stands for facial drooping. A for arm weakness. S for speech difficulty. And when we identify any of these symptoms, we have to immediately call the stroke helpline number. So, what is a stroke unit? Stroke unit is a designated place inside the hospital where the acute stroke patients are cared for. It comprises of a multidisciplinary team comprising of medical nursing, physiotherapy, occupational therapy, speech and language therapy, etc. It has been found in the study that treatment in a stroke unit improves the chances of survival, reduces dependency, and reduces the need for institutional care later on. So, as soon as the patient arrives in the ED, we have to take care of the ABCs as we always do, and we have to make a quick clinical examination and history taking to ascertain the onset of symptoms, comorbidities, any prior use of medications, any recent events. Physical examination is done quickly to look for any signs of trauma, carotid bruit, congestive heart failure, etc. And after doing a quick examination, we have to do what is known as NIHS, National Institute of Health Stroke Score. It's a 11-point scoring system, and it integrates component of a neurological examination. It comprises of questions pertaining to level of consciousness, selected cranial of examination, motor senses, cerebellar function, language, and intonation. The maximum score is 42 and minimum is 0. I will not go into the details. It's available as a free application in the mobile phones. So, depending on the NIH score, we can grade the severity of the stroke into minor, moderate to severe, and severe stroke. So, the purpose of the emergency diagnostic test in the ED is to determine the different types of stroke, because the management are completely different for the different types of strokes. So, the minimum diagnostic test that should be ordered inside the ED is a non-contrast CT. I would prefer an MRI if it is feasible. A blood glucose, because hypoglycemia can be a stroke mimic. Renal parameters, because sometimes we may have to go for a CT angiogram which requires injection of a dye. ECG to rule out any coexisting atrial fibrillation. Markers of cardiac ischemia, CBC including platelet count, because antithrombotic therapy would be a contraindication if the platelet counts are low. PTINR for the same reason, oxygen saturation. So now, once we have selected our patient appropriately, what to do next? We have to take certain steps to restore the perfusion. The whole idea is that the blood supply of a particular area of brain is acutely compromised because of either a clot or a hemorrhage. So, if it's a ischemic stroke, we have to do the intravenous thrombolysis, which is the standard of care. Actually, intravenous thrombolysis and endovascular thrombectomy, these are the two FDA approved treatment modalities. They are the standard of care as far as the treatment of acute ischemic stroke is concerned. Sometimes we can combine these. So now coming to the basic thing, the intravenous thrombolysis. Intravenous thrombolysis, we have to hurry. As we discussed earlier, the time window is very narrow. So studies have shown that as soon as the patient arrives in the ED and the patient is appropriately selected, and we give the alteplase, the tissue plasminogen activator, within 3 hours of symptom onset, the prognosis is very good. So what are the inclusion criteria? What are the patients who should be given the IV TPA? There should be a diagnosis of ischemic stroke causing a measurable neurological deficit. The neurological signs should not be clearly spontaneously, and the onset of symptoms should be less than 3 hours. So we have to carefully select the patient and rule out the patient depending on the exclusion criteria. For example, the following patient should not be thrombolized if there is a history of stroke or head trauma within 3 months, a major surgery within 2 weeks, GI bleed within 21 days, in a prior history of intracranial hemorrhage, acute MI or MI within 3 months, a lumbar puncture within 7 days arterial puncture at a non-compressible site, rapidly improving on minor symptoms. Of course, there are many stroke committed like seizure, post-ictal state, in which we are not supposed to thrombolyze the patient. Symptoms of SAH, even if the CT is negative, BP, if the patient is hypertensive, although it's a relative contraindication, we can bring down the BP and we can thrombolyze the patient. If the patient is pregnant, if there is active bleeding or trauma, platelet count less than 1 lakh, glucose is less than 50 or more than 400, we can appropriately, if the iron is more than 1.7, if there is hemorrhage on CT, or if there is a major infarct on CT. So, the guidelines have been set about as to what is the ideal time for the different steps of intervention. The physician, as soon as the patient arrives in the ED, physician evaluation should be completed by 10 minutes. The stroke team should be activated within 15 minutes. Imaging should be completed within 25 minutes. Interpretation should be done within 45 minutes. And the road to middle time is 60 minutes. The patient should have been thrombolyzed within 60 minutes of the arrival of the patient. So what do we do? So the standard the chemical that we give to the patient is Ultimis. There is a recombinant tissue plasminogen activator. The dose is 0.9 mg per kg. Maximum dose is 90 mg, which is to be given over 60 minutes. 10% of which is to be given as a bolus over 1 minute, and the rest is given over 1 hour. And as soon as we have given the RTPA, we have to shift the patient thereafter into the stroke unit for further monitoring and care. So, while we are infusing, while we are giving the drug, we have to assess the patient very carefully. We have to keep a very close eye on whether the patient is worsening. So, if in that case we have to stop the infusion, we have to do an urgent CT. If there is any hemorrhagic transformation, we have to take appropriate intervention. So, after the patient has been thrombolyzed, we have to monitor the patient in the stroke unit, and we have to perform the neurological assessments and the blood pressure measurements every 15 minutes during the first 30 minutes, during the first 2 hours, and then every 30 minutes for the subsequent 6 hours, and then hourly every 24 minutes. So, there are certain things which have to be kept in mind. For example, if the blood pressure shoots up, we have to give antihypertensive. So this is one exception where we have to lower down the blood pressure after the patient has been thrombolyzed, because we talk about the permissible hypertension in the patients who are not the candidates for thrombolysis. Anyway, so after the patient has been thrombolyzed, we have to delay the placement of nasogastric tubes, intravenous catheters, or any sampling or intra-arterial catheter insertion. After 24 hours, we have to do a check CT. Ideally, an MRI can also be done before starting the antithrombotics like anticoagulation or antiplatelets. So the predictors of success include the early treatment, less severe symptoms, younger age, lack of hypertension, and normalization. So this is a meta-analysis of the several RCTs performed, published in Lancet Neurology, in which we can see that the chances of functional independence at 3 months, defined as a modified ranking score of 0 to 1, is greatest when the patient is thrombolyzed within 3 hours of symptom onset. And as we can see here, age is no contraindication. In patients who are even above 80 years of age, we can safely thrombolyze the patient with a good outcome. And this benefit is seen across all the range of NIH scores, especially the early NIH scores. So, but it's not always that simple. The patient do not arrive the ED in time. Patient might arrive in the ED like after 6 hours or something. So there is a modality intra-arterial thrombolysis, in which we have to do the groin puncture. We have to take the catheter of the thrombosis. We have to then we infuse the thrombolytic at that site only. So especially this is indicated for those patients who arrive at like 6 hours of symptom onset. And so this was recently assessed in the PRO-ACT trial, and so was a 6-hour time window, unlike 3 hours time window. and however the evidence is not very good. The level of evidence is only CE. Now we will walk you through some of the recent cases I have managed in the emergency. So this was a 51-year-old male who presented in the ED with accelerated hypertension. We are all geared up for thrombolizing the patient. We immediately shifted the patient. The patient arrived within 3 hours of symptom onset. We immediately shifted the patient to the MRI suite. As soon as the DWI was performed, we could find that the patient was having hemorrhage. We did a CT correlation, and this is what we found. We aborted the procedure, of course, and the patient was managed conservatively. Now, this is a young male. He was a student, very bright student. Rheumatic heart disease, severe mitral stenosis. Unfortunately, he developed in-hospital stroke. This is the DWI scan, and we can see that there are some changes on the flare also. So we did an angio, and we can see that there is complete occlusion of the L1 segment of the right NCA. So this was an ideal candidate for mechanical thrombectomy. The patient was taken into the angiography suite, and with the help of a stent retriever, we could remove this clot, and the check the angiogram, we can see that there is complete recanalization of the L1 segment of the right NCA. And the patient had an immediate clinical recovery. Within 3 hours of this procedure, the patient was moving his arm, which was completely immobile. Now again, I would like to show this patient. This was a 60-year hypertensive and diabetic. He came to me in the OPD, and he complained that he had weakness, sudden onset weakness in the left leg, for which was not able to walk for around 15 minutes. So traditionally, as per the traditional definition, he would have fitted in the criteria of PI. But now the definition of PI requires a neuroimaging. Only after the neuroimaging is clear, only then we can label a diagnosis of PI. So here we could see a small infarct. The angios were clear. Obviously the patient did not do anything. We just kept the patient on integrated, dual integrated, and the patient went okay. Now again, this was a 41-year-old diabetic male. He was admitted in the orthopedics for repair of patellar fracture. So he also developed in-hospital stroke, and we could catch hold of this patient within 1 hour of symptoms. We can see his parasagital infarct on DWI, and the interesting thing is that the corresponding flare images do not show any changes. So we thrombolized, we gave the patient RTP, and there was an immediate recovery. The angios were clear. So after we have done the thrombolysis, IV thrombolysis, what next? The patient should be started on some antithrombotic therapy. Antithrombotic therapy can be antiplatelet or anticoagulation, and again it depends on whether the patient is having a non-cardioembolic stroke or a cardioembolic stroke. So in case of patients having non-cardioembolic stroke, the use of antiplatelets is recommended rather than anticoagulation. And if the patient has been thrombolized, we should delay the administration of antiplatelets for 24 hours at least. Aspirin monotherapy, the combination of aspirin, dipyridamole, clopidogrel, all acceptable options. Sometimes the patient is allergic to aspirin. In that case, we can use clopidogrel also. There was one patient who had severe rashes all over the body. He was admitted under our care only. So we had to stop the aspirin, and we had to discharge him of clopidogrel monotherapy only. So now a word about the cardioembolic stroke. If the patient is having AF, then the patient is a candidate for anticoagulation rather than antiplatelet therapy. Traditionally, we have been using vitamin K antagonists like warfarin or acetone. But now newer anticoagulants have come, like dabigatran, apixaban. Dabigatran is a direct thrombin inhibitor, and apixaban, edoxaban, rivaroxaban, these are activated factor 10A inhibitors. So regarding the timing of anticoagulation in cardioembolic stroke, the thumb rule is that the larger the infarct, the longer should we wait for initiating the anticoagulation, because obviously there is a risk of hemorrhagic transformation. So after we have started the antithrombotic therapy, general supportive care is very important, which comprises of airway maintenance, temperature regulation, and normothermia should be maintained. Cardiac monitoring is very important because in our hospital we do a cardiac evaluation of every stroke patient, because we never know. Echocardiography and Holter is routinely done in all our patients. Hypertension should be managed. Avoid about permissive hypertension. In those patients who are not candidates for IV TPA, we do not aggressively treat the hypertension unless it is about 200. So unless the patient is in hypertensive encephalopathy or it's aortic dissection, true renal failure, pulmonary edema, or myocardial infarction. So the different agents can be used to lower down the blood pressure depending on whether the patient is eligible for thrombotic therapy, thrombolysis or not. So again, hypotension has to be managed appropriately by using fluid resuscitation and use of selective use of inotrope. Blood sugar normalizemia has to be maintained in the range of 50 to 140 mg per deciliter. Now coming to the treatment of acute neurological complications. So what are the neurological complications? There are three major neurological complications which can afflict the stroke patients. The swelling of the ischemic tissue causing the mass effect, hemorrhagic transformation, and seizures. So how do we manage this ischemic brain swelling? First of all, the patient is in ICU, we have to restrict free water, hypoosmolar IV fluid should be avoided, head end should be elevated, and use of selective use of hyperosmotic agents like mannitol and 3% saline. So sometimes if the patient does not respond to the hyperosmotic agents, we have to do the surgery also. For example, in posterior fossa stroke, we have to do the suboccipital craniotomy to relieve the intracranial pressure. Hemorrhagic transformation. The larger the infarct, the greater is the risk for hemorrhagic transformation. So that is why we have to, like in cardioembolic stroke, just we discussed that if the size of the infarct is large, we have to wait for a longer time before initiating anticoagulation. So if the hemorrhagic transformation is not big enough, we can manage it conservatively, or it may require cardiac evacuation. Seizures should be managed appropriately. There is no role of prophylactic anti-seizure therapy. Now other complications, like the general medical complications like aspiration pneumonitis, DVT, pulmonary embolism, pressure sores, agitation, they should be managed appropriately. UTI. Now coming to secondary prevention. Secondary prevention of the stroke requires the blood pressure regulation, lowering the blood pressure by different agents, normoglycemia, control of diabetes, lipid lowering agents, and lifestyle changes like cigarette smoking should be discouraged, consumption of alcohol, and Mediterranean diet is recommended, like the diet low in salt and saturated fat, high in fruits and vegetables, etc., and weight reduction. Antioxidant and vitamin supplementation not recommended. And there is one case for cryptogenic stroke, in which it has been recommended that the endovascular closure of PFO can be considered in those patients in which the etiology of the stroke remains undetermined, and if we find on TE that there is an evidence of PFO. Neuroprotection, although we use several agents routinely in our patients for neuroprotection like citicoline and all, but the evidence is not there. So these are the different agents we can use for the cerebroprotective purposes. Rehabilitation is very important. After the patient is left with some disability, it is the rehabilitation which makes all the difference. So even with optimal care, only 1/3 of the patient fully recover from their stroke symptoms. Early mobilization, early physiotherapy, they are the key to good functional recovery. So physiotherapy, occupational therapy, and So it's a team effort basically. Management of stroke requires a multidisciplinary team. Only neurologists or a neurosurgeon are not good enough to manage the stroke by themselves. It requires a whole team comprising of physiotherapists, occupational therapists, and the nursing staff plays a very role. Good ICU setup is also very important as far as the management of stroke is concerned. So it's only with the team effort that we can assure a good functional recovery for those patients. But I would like to stress one thing, that at the current scenario, the detection of the stroke in the field is very poor. Patients do not reach the hospital in time, and that is one of the major determinants why the outcome of the stroke is very poor. And nowadays, the management of stroke is not only linked to IV thrombolysis, it has gone much ahead of that. Intravenous thrombolysis is required in all the cases, but intravenous thrombolysis in itself is not sufficient to open up, not sufficient to reperfuse those areas of brain, recanalize those arteries. If the size of the clot is big, if the caliber of the vessels is very large, in those cases the role of endovascular thrombectomy is there, and endovascular thrombectomy, the time window is also greater as compared to the IV thrombolysis, in which the time window is at max 4.5 hours from the symptom onset. In endovascular thrombectomy, the time window, as per the recent trials, up to 24 hours the patient can be, if the patient selection is good, the patient can be taken up for thrombectomy and a transfer of functional recovery is very good. In that, I would like to thank my sponsor, Cadence Healthcare, Anish Pharma, and of course the PSI Hospital. So thank you.
That was a beautiful recapitulation of all the history, physical examination, and various aspects of the treatment. Where is Dr. Chauhan? I think in his absence, I can call Dr. Shubham for inviting the next speaker.
Thank you so much, sir.
I have a question, Dr. Basar. First of all, wonderful talk. I know you as a gentleman, but today I knew you as a very good neurologist who is very clear in his thought process and very well planned. My question is, at times patients comes to our clinic, with transient weakness in one limb or the other limb on one side, and this weakness lasts only for maybe few minutes, at times for hours, and then it goes away. The problem in India is that if there is a chest pain, the entire household will bring the patient to the doctor. But when it comes to the mind, this is the problem, that even if there is complete hemiplegia, I'm not referring to transient weakness, even if there is complete hemiplegia, the relatives will wait overnight and say, भैया अब तो जो हो गया, अब ऐसा करते हैं, कल चलते हैं. And adding to the problem is that जितनी भी शायरी होती है हिंदुस्तान के अंदर, वो सारी की सारी दिल पे है. दिल तो पागल है, ठीक है, मतलब दिमाग के ऊपर तो वो ध्यान नहीं देता. अवेयरनेस जो है for brain issues is very limited. Although you people teach that time is brain, but everyone only understands that time is muscle. This is the problem. Your feedback on that?
Yes, sir, you are absolutely right. Very often patients come to our clinics, transient weakness of a limb or a face, maybe, and people tend to dismiss it as TIA. But as I said during my talk, I told earlier they used to define TIA as that any symptom which resolves within 24 hours of symptom onset is labeled as TIA. But it was later found that many of such patients, when we do a neuroimaging, they have a small minor strokes also. So even minor strokes can present like this. Symptoms completely resolve. As I showed the case of a 41-year-old male who had a weakness of the left leg for 15 minutes only. So this would have been just passed off as a TIA, but when we did the neuroimaging, we found it was indeed a stroke, actually a stroke, minor stroke. So such all patients should be referred to a neurologist ideally, sir, for evaluation.
And they should be worked out.
Yes, sir. they
Because
should be-
within 3 months, many of them will have a full-fledged stroke.
Yes, sir. And it could be, even if it's a TIA, it could be a minor, it could be a warning symptom. A major stroke might be impending, which might lead to a major disability or death also.
Sir, my second question is concerning a very, very important issue that many of us face in our clinics, and that is of dizziness, vertigo.
Right.
And at times this leads to posterior supination stroke, or this is
Right.
a harbinger of posterior supination strokes. My question is, when a patient comes to you with persistent dizziness associated with vomiting, unsteadiness of gait, what should be my approach? What would you tell me that you investigate this patient on this line?
Yes, sir. A very good question, sir. Clinically speaking, now the patient profile matters a lot. So the patient profile matters a lot. If the patient that you just described is a 60-year-old male who is a smoker, who is a diabetic, who is a hypertensive, who is having a coronary artery, he is having all these symptoms, definitely the likelihood of having a posterior supination stroke would be much higher as compared to a benign condition like liberingitis or a BPPP. So it all depends on the clinical scenario. If the patient is a young male, like 20 years, no comorbidity, the likelihood of having a posterior supination would be very less. So clinically speaking, we can rule it on just based on the clinical scenario. So, but you might have certain gray areas also, like the patient is middle-aged.
So you would tell us that if a patient comes to me with symptoms of dizziness, severe vertigo and vomiting, I must be very careful and I should rule out a posterior supination stroke in this patient. And not only classify this patient as cervical spondylosis,
Yes, sir.
or maybe,
It's a common misnomer.
It's-
Cervical spondylosis does not
doesn't lead to
does not cause dizziness.
and we always feel that there is cervical spondylosis,
Yes, sir.
which is not the case.
Which is not the case. Which is never the case.
Which is not the case.
Yes.
Sir, my third question is, suppose I have a 20-year-old person. I'm just relating it to, sir, because I saw a case like this, 22-year-old with very significant family history of familial hypercholesterolemia.
Yes.
And this patient came to me with very vague kind of symptoms. And when I got his vertebral Doppler done, he had a 100% left internal carotid artery blockage. How significant is that? And sir, how should we progress with this 22-year-old person with a 100% LICA block?
So this is an unusual case. Actually, in 20-year-old, we would never suspect vascular.
With a documented history of familial hypercholesterolemia.
So that is one a clue that we should be more careful because he was having a history of familial hypercholesterolemia.
So we should be very careful in evaluating these people and not leave him just because he is 22-year-old. Right.
Right.
Sir, my question for everyone, and it will benefit everyone. If I have a patient of transient ischemic stroke,
Yes, sir. Yes.
should I put this patient on full monty of antiplatelets
So
or
dual antiplatelets for 21 days.
only for 21 days?
Yes, sir. And then we can shift to the monotherapy. Platelet
Monotherapy of what?
Aspirin or clopidogrel. We usually give aspirin monotherapy, 75 milligram.
Aspirin monotherapy.
Yes, sir.
Right. Sir, there is an issue of aspirin dose when it comes to transient ischemic stroke.
Yes, sir.
There are certain studies which say that 150 milligram is better than 75 milligram. Sir, your advice for all of us.
Sir, in minor stroke and TIA, ideally we do the loading dose. Loading dose of aspirin is 325 milligram and the loading dose of clopidogrel is 300 to 600 milligram. We usually give 300 milligram for clopidogrel and 325 milligram of aspirin. And then subsequently we can go on with 150 milligram of aspirin and 75 milligram of clopidogrel.
Dr. Sen has a question.
So the case mentioned by Dr. Chauhan, 21-year-old with a 100% ICA block, you would not do anything to open that?
Yes, sir. I would call my neurointervention colleague, Dr. Sumit Goel.
And and continue with the antiplatelets and everything, whatever there is.
Antiplatelets won't help if there is mechanical obstruction. It has to be opened up.
Sir, I'd like to answer this.
And I must mention that this person did not have any neurological deficit.
Yeah,
I want to mention that.
so, sir, I'm Dr. Sumit Goel. I'm a neurointerventionist here. Closely work with Dr. Bhaskar. So, first of all, we have to see that 100% is on what modality. So, an MR angio, we have enough number of cases
Then
now.
it was an MR angio.
So, MR angio, sir.
First was a Doppler and then an MR angio, which both of them showed 100% LICA
Occlusion.
block.
So if it's a proven LIC, 100% occlusion, we do not intervene and we do not open up the vessel because we believe that there are enough collaterals which are taken over the brain, especially if the patient is asymptomatic. Unlike the cardiology people where we have.
So if you have enough collateralization, if you can see on the MR angio, then I'm okay. So would you just leave it or you
No.
still go ahead and do it?
No, sir. So ideal modality is digital suppression angiography. So we should do a DSA of these patients. So we have enough number of patients where an MR and even the last carotid that we have done at PSRI, he came in acute stroke with thrombolysis. MR angio showed a 100% occlusion. We did a DSA in secondary for secondary management and there was a 99% occlusion. So there was a thin flow of contrast going into the internal carotid and we could open up that vessel. So an MR angio actually overestimates the degree of occlusion. This is adequately proved. If an MR angio shows there is a 80% occlusion, most of the time when you do a CT angio or a Doppler, you would see the occlusion is 60% or 50%. CT angio is a better modality because it uses the contrast. Doppler is a very good modality, but the problem with Doppler is it's a user-dependent modality like ultrasound. So you should have a trust on the person who is doing your Doppler sonography. So ideally, a CT angiography as a non-invasive modality. Otherwise, DSA is the gold standard for deciding intervention is required in these patients or not.
So if a patient has a significant blockade of 75% block in any of the majors and is asymptomatic, for example, and comes to you and you pick it up, like in coronary angiography, you have a system of doing an FFA. So do you have a similar system of doing something like this for the...
Again, sir, the indications in the neck and the brain intracranial part is different. So we have level 1 evidence for the neck intervention that if you have a symptomatic lesion.
Do you do something like an FFA?
No, we don't do any FFA kind of a thing. If you have a symptomatic lesion more than 50% in neck, it requires an intervention. Especially if the lesion is ulcerated or a dirty plaque, you require intervention. Unfortunately, for intracranial lesion, we do not have level 1 evidence because one of the trials called Sampras trials has failed showing the benefit of intracranial stenting in symptomatic patients who had whatever degree of stenosis. So medical management is proven, but as an interventionist, we have a feeling and we have realized that patients who have failed on good medical management, more than 75% of stenosis, even an intracranial stenting does help.
So in an Indian who usually has bad genes and bad genetics and everything, I think you should be aggressive enough to do it in somebody who's even 60% plus and symptoms plus minus whatever.
Absolutely, especially for the plaque morphology. In fact, a lot of work is being done these days on plaque morphology. Recently attended a meeting where somebody from Kokila Behan has presented in Mumbai. They are stenting even patients with less than 50% stenosis. Doing a plaque morphology analysis on an MR, unfortunately not many people are doing plaque morphology even in North India.
Push in an IVS to do see.
No. So they are basically relying on the MR pictures of the plaque. Like if a plaque is showing intraplaque hemorrhage, that's a very vulnerable plaque. You should patients having repeated DIL, plaque not responding to double integrated. MR angiogram is showing hemorrhage in the plaque. Probably these are the candidates for stenting, but obviously less than 50% we do not have class 1 recommendations, so we have to be very cautious for telling them, especially in this medical legal era.
Thank you.
I think
Very wonderfully answered by Dr. Sumit. Sir, I want to ask you, since we are talking about an acute ischemic stroke, now in a posterior circulation stroke, if there is a vertebral artery dissection documented, do you stent it?
Wonderful question, sir. Actually, vertebral artery dissection depends what is the presentation. It can be hemorrhage and it can be ischemia also. So a dissection can lead to bleeding also and it can lead to ischemic stroke.
Ischemic, not,
So-
there's no.
So again, sir, we have to do a DSA first. We have to see how much territory of brain is actually dependent on that vertebral artery. So because both the vertebral arteries are going to form a basilar artery intracranially, the aim is to prevent the basilar artery. So sometimes one of the vertebral arteries is hypoplastic. So if it is a hypoplastic artery which is got dissected, we might go on a conservative management. And if it is a dominant artery which is dissected and which is involved a major vessel like a pica or something, we might have to stent it. So honestly, there is no one word answer to it, but it needs evaluation.
Your experience, have you stented or dissected vertebral artery?
No, I have not dissected an acute vertebral dissection. I have stented an acute carotid dissection. It was a long dissection in carotid artery. I have put in 2 overlapping stents, which normally we do not do in carotid artery. But acute vertebral artery dissection, we probably would like to stay conservative unless it is a dominant artery which is taken over a major vessel.
Wonderful, sir. Really, I think we deserve to be there actually. If we can arrange.
Suno.
Devin.
No, let people be aware that you are there, sir. Unless
आप आए हो तो
please be there, sir. थोड़ा झेलो भी ना सर, थोड़ा झेलो जरा. Be there. I'm sure there must be some more questions on neurology. There are some more questions on neurology. Dr. Mangla sir, you have a question on neurology. I'm sure you have, sir.
We are seeing quite frequently, we have seen 3-4 cases of pulmonary embolism at Mitchell Hospital where we found some protein C, protein S or some factor V related mutations. How often these problems present as stroke? How often you find the hypercoagulable state presenting as stroke?
Sir, in practice they are very rare actually. I am yet to find one because we often, especially if it's a case of stroke in young, we always do the thrombophilia workup. And very often we find elevated levels of homocysteine or equivocal reports of factor.
How do you react to homocystinemia, hyperhomocystinemia?
So, yes, sir, we give vitamin B12 and folic acid. Yes, sir. And but it's very difficult to correlate the cause and effect relationship.
How is it that it causes more pulmonary embolism than strokes? The hyper. What I was saying, we have had strokes in the young.
Yes, sir.
And somebody presenting with chest pain, unexplained, like some kind of an infarct which was read as pneumonia. But this guy had some history of surgery 1 year back. And everything came negative. But it was a gut feeling that whatever is looking at the CT, and we did a CPPA and we found there was pulmonary embolism. So I'm just asking how often they present as infarcts. I mean, brain infarct.
Sir, the source of emboli is usually, if we are talking about the embolus, the source is usually the heart, cardioembolic stroke, especially like the case we discussed of a young male who was having a tried mitral stenosis with rheumatic heart disease. He had a LA thrombus which just went off and blocked the.
Also, when we treat these patients, the cause of concern is whether they develop a bleed inside.
Thank you, Mangla sir. With your inputs on your field, sir. Mariana, Dr. Dulce, sir, just a minute.
Dr. Bhaskar, so if you have a young patient, what is the, I mean, with a stroke kind of a presentation, what is the usual protocol of evaluation for all the other, the other risk factors which may have precipitated? Sir talked about protein C, yes, you talk about anti-cardiolipin antibodies, etc. Is there a fixed set of protocol of tests that you do for such patients so that future or the family or anybody can be kind of identified and generally risk stratification can be done?
in stroke in the young, the risk factors remain the same actually. So hypertension, like secondary hypertension is more common in these patients. Like the patient is having a renal vascular or renal parenchyma and he is having secondary hypertension, or he is having a heart disease or some cardiomyopathy or a rheumatic heart disease. PFO is also one of the etiologies which should be considered. So this hypercoagulable state is, I mean, it is very often cited, but it's not very commonly seen. It has been, rather it has been in the protocols, it's useless actually. Sometimes not much use if we do the thrombophlebium. Although we do, myself I do, if I see a patient, then if I find, then I have to put the patient on anticoagulation lifelong.
I think thrombophlebium profile is more important for venous strokes, like CVT and all. That is obviously not, we are not discussing.
Dr. Bhaskar, your DM Viva starts now.
Sir, you must have used karaoke. There is a prelude to the song. So, prelude to Dr. Tulsi's questions, my prelude, I will just set the ball rolling, sir. मुझे डॉक्टर चौहान आपने कहा था दिल तो पागल है,
दिल तो पागल है,
हाँ, लेकिन खराब तो दिमाग ही होता है।
हाँ, दिमाग खराब होता है।
हाँ, दिमाग खराब होता है। तो दिल पागल होता है, दिमाग खराब होता है, दोनों की आपस में यूनिटी है, एक तरह से यूनिफॉर्मिटी है, एक दूसरे से मिले जुले हैं। तो जब भी हम स्ट्रोक होता है, चाहे ब्रेन का हो, चाहे हार्ट का हो, we have to give that thrombolysis. Just my single question is, have you ever used RTPA for frostbite? Frostbite. It is also recommended for that. Sir, my boss will ask the question. मैं तो एक वो stage बांध रहा हूँ.
So, thank you, Dr. Chauhan. So very interactive seminar today. So recent guidelines have allowed the extension of time for IVT and EVT. I'm talking about the tissue window approach, see, guided by advanced neuroimaging, and not 3, not 4.5, maybe up till 24 hours. So thanks to the recent neuroimagings, the 3 neuroimagings, the DWI and the FLAIR, and not to forget about the CTP. So to distinguish between core and penumbra, so salvageable tissues, so these are probably advanced modalities and are being increasingly used. See, benefit in patients, on IVT or an EVT or words on that, sir? Tell us.
Yes, sir. So especially if the patient presents to us within 6 hours of time window, then the role of these advanced imaging like CT perfusion and penumbra imaging as we are talking about is limited. But if the patient presents beyond 6 hours, then the role of these penumbra imaging is very much. And if you find a salvageable tissue, if you find a at-risk area of brain, then the role of this mechanical thrombectomy becomes even more.
To further my question, so patients treated with altiplase are known to have reocclusions in about 14 to 34% of the cases. So, would you advise probably a tenecteplase instead of TPA, have more fibrin specificity, longer half-life, less intracranial bleeds, and has to be given just with a single bolus injection? So, why are we afraid to use tenecteplase?
No, sir. I myself have used tenecteplase several number of times. And there was a recent article in NEJM, Extend IATNK. It was designed for non-inferiority, and it was tenecteplase was found to be non-inferior to altiplase. So, and probably because it was not designed for superiority, it might be even superior. Of course, the advantage is that it can be given a single bolus, and the risk of spontaneous intracranial hemorrhage is no different between the altiplase and the tenecteplase.
Absolutely. This is what the JAMA Neurology 2019 published an article and said a meta-analysis of 6 non-randomized trials involving 1820 patients, 1820 patients, as I said, that probably the superior efficacy seen, at least twofold greater efficacy seems. You see, with tenecteplase as compared to the GPA. So, just my last question to you regarding, you see, a recent article published in NAGM is talked about the attention trial. So that trial was a 4-year trial on AIS, that's acute ischemic strokes, and caused by basal artery occlusions. So this is often associated, we know, with poor outcomes and higher mortality, higher severity of the strokes. So tell us through, it's successfully demonstrated that the superiority of EVT is here to be pressed. So EVT in acute basilar infarct. Tell us, sir.
I'd like to answer this. Your very first question about penumbra and correlation.
Absolutely.
For posterior circulation, unfortunately, since our core area is brainstem. So, even if the volume is less, if you don't have a brainstem, you won't survive. So that is so even before the penumbra imaging and all became a evidence-based trial, interventionists world over are doing basilar artery thrombectomy even in 48 hours. I personally had an experience of patients where I have intervened more than 24 hours later. Because the brainstem was not infarcted, there was cerebellar infarct. The patient was thrombolized in one of the prominent hospitals in North Delhi. The patient deteriorated, he was intubated, we shifted the patient to PSI. We repeated a scan, the basilar artery was not seen, but the brainstem was not infarcted. We took the patient to lab, it was around 24 hours or something. This patient still comes in follow-up. He's absolutely all tracheostomy is taken off, he walks, obviously he has some residual disability. So the point is, sir, basilar artery is essential for survival. So you have to maintain the flow in basilar artery. So even if at 24 hours, 28 hours, 30 hours, there are reports where 48 hours after stroke people have recanalized basilar artery. So we're seeing the basilar artery is occluded, and you can try open it up. If the brainstem is not infarcted, it is worth a try. In fact, adding to it, I had similar cases, not success stories. 2.5 hours, I had gone inside, I tried and open up the vessel, I failed. Probably if I would have done a perfusion scan in those cases, I would have demonstrated no penumbra. So these are the patients who probably would never come back.
Right.
But then there are debates that what kind of imaging you should do. So for 6 years since LBO, we do not have any option. We have to actually offer them intervention. We don't waste time in perfusion imaging. But otherwise, yes, more than 6 hours we have to do perfusion imaging and brain posterior circulation, irrespective of perfusion imaging. If the brainstem is patent, please give them a trial if the basilar is occluded.
My last question. A call to the neurologists to please use GLP-1 agonists. See, these are anti-atherosclerotic drugs and they reduce the incidence of strokes, not only strokes, including, you see, atrial fibrillation as well. So please use GLP-1 agonists. What do you say, sir?
They won't have any idea.
Okay, let Dr. Chauhan answer this question. Let him answer this question.
I think that is a hardcore diabetes issue basically. And there is a lot of data now emerging. That's what I'm saying. There is now a lot of data emerging on GLP-1 agonists as being anti-atherosclerotic agents and anti-aging agents.
So it's a secondary profile.
Yes, that is right. Dr. Tulsi is right, and more data is coming. So that for another forum. I think we must give a big hand to Dr. Bhaskar and a wonderful moderation by our own Dr. Yogesh Pal sir. Thank you very much, sir. Now we